Getting personal. The Pope's personal envoy shows solidarity with Iraqi Christians. In the heat of the race, a young driver is struck and killed by NASCAR star Tony Stewart. Backtracking. Perhaps we didn't get the full story on baby Gammy from his surrogate mother. And before the fall, can high-tech shoes help protect the elderly from dangerous accidents? Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Monday, August 11, 2014. Good evening. Thank you for joining us on this Monday. I'm Brian Patrick as we look at your news now. A political showdown in Iraq as two leaders struggle for power. The new president, Fuad Massoum, is snubbing the powerful Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. He's nominating the deputy parliament speaker as the new prime minister. Iraqi television reports the Supreme Court has ruled al-Maliki has the right to form a government because he has the largest bloc in parliament. But any new government needs presidential approval, and that has not been given. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says it is time for Iraq to move forward.
One thing all Iraqis need to know, that there will be little international support of any kind whatsoever for anything that deviates from the legitimate constitutional process that is in place and being worked on now. They need to finish that and give a new government an opportunity to be voted on and move forward.
The U.S. is indicating it supports the president over the prime minister and hopes al-Maliki will not stir the waters. Well, the mounting political showdown comes as the U.S. carried out new strikes in northern Iraq. America is also providing weapons to Kurdish forces, making gains now against Islamic militants. We talked by Skype today with Kris Ozar, emergency team leader for Catholic Relief Services in Erbil, and he describes what he's seen and heard since arriving there.
Well, we're seeing tens of thousands of Iraqi internally displaced people flooding into the city of Erbil, taking refuge in churches, parks, schools, and half-constructed buildings. Huddled masses taking refuge really wherever they can, sometimes with only the contents and the clothes on their back.
And what are you hearing from these people about their predicament?
Well, most people are wondering and waiting for humanitarian assistance, waiting for the United Nations, their implementing partners, and waiting and wondering what tomorrow will bring. Many of them know they aren't able to go back to their homes and are really wondering what to do now.
And what is it that Catholic Relief Services is able to do on the ground there right now, Kris?
We are providing life-saving supplies to thousands of internally displaced here in Erbil, providing food and other non-food supplies. And that is to meet their basic needs now. We'll also be working with them and committed to getting their children back into school, working on psychosocial support for the trauma needs. These people have certainly been through an incredible ordeal, and helping the men and women access wage and self-employment opportunities so they can rebuild their lives. We are expecting that this conflict will continue and people will not be able to return home immediately. And we'll be looking at possible resettlement services for thousands of these Iraqis.
And Kris tells us we can support the work of Catholic Relief Services in Iraq by visiting crs.org and clicking on Donate or Act Now. As Catholics in the U.S. are joining Pope Francis in praying for peace in Iraq, Wyatt Goolsby reports from the Basilica of the National Shrine here in Washington tonight. Wyatt?
Brian, bishops across America are calling for the faithful to pray for peace. There are several dioceses that have organized events starting tonight that's to help show support for persecuted Christians, but also in general to pray for an end to violence in the region.
Militants with the Islamic State are seizing control of Iraqi territory. The terrorists are brutal and relentless. They execute some prisoners, others they force to convert. Pope Francis strongly condemned their actions on Sunday.
All this gravely offends God and humanity. Hatred is not to be carried out in the name of God.
Francis gave his blessing to Cardinal Fernando Filoni, who arrived in Iraq today as the Pope's personal envoy. Filoni says he'll provide support for Christians targeted by Islamic militants.
How can any pastor of souls see his faithful suffering and not speak for them? People often think that persecution was in the early church, and there's very little of it now. In fact, as the Pope reminded us in one of his tweets, there's a terrible persecution going on all throughout the world now.
Monsignor Charles Pope says Catholics here in the U.S. can make a difference for Christians who are far away. How? With prayer.
And we often forget that every time we say the creed on Sunday, people died for that creed. And people suffered terrible loss because of that creed. So the faith is costly, and that we should never forget the magnificent gift of the faith to us.
U.S. bishops have also encouraged the faithful to pray this Sunday using this prayer from the Patriarch of the Chaldean Church in Iraq. And tonight, the Archdiocese of Denver and New York will hold services. They'll be asking God for courage to continue their witness.
Bishops are urging all people of faith, not just Catholics or Christians, to pray for persecuted Iraqis. We've also learned tonight that hundreds of displaced Christians in the northern part of Iraq are calling for help from the international community. They say they want to leave their war-torn country permanently. Brian?
Wyatt Goolsby at the National Shrine here in Washington. Paul Salem is the Vice President for Policy and Research at the Middle East Institute. Paul, why is ISIS targeting religious minorities?
Well, ISIS is doing ethnic cleansing on a horrific scale. It is clamping down on the Sunni Muslims under its jurisdiction and imposing very, very stringent Islamic rules on them. It is evicting or killing any Shiite Muslims in that region. It is also evicting or killing or forcing to convert Christians that are there and that have been there since the dawn of Christianity. And it's also tried to obliterate a pre-Christian community called the Yazidis, who have been mentioned by President Obama, who are now stranded on a mountaintop there. So they are trying to create a sort of an ethnically cleansed region in that part of Iraq and parts of eastern Syria.
They call it the Islamic State. Are the airstrikes by the U.S. making any difference?
Yes, the airstrikes are stopping the advances of this group, the Islamic State in the north. They stopped their advances on this particular mountaintop where several tens of thousands are stranded. They've also reversed the advances that the Islamic State was making against Kurdish forces in the north, and now we hear the Kurds are making gains against the Islamic State, and that's very important. Obama indicated that he might use airstrikes in support of the government in Baghdad once the government there chooses a new prime minister, as they did today, and form a new government.
So we'll see what the president has to say about that a little later, but what is the reception among Muslims and the Arab world to the U.S. actions right now?
Well, in general, I would say it's been muted but welcoming, both in the Arab Sunni Muslim world, interestingly also in Iran as well. There's been great horror as to what this group has been doing in the name of God or the name of Islam. There are some reservations saying that the U.S. intervened when Sunni groups were massacring, civilians, while it did not intervene when the Syrian government, headed by another religious community, Alawite Shiite community, was massacring people in Syria. So it does raise the question that if President Obama chooses to intervene correctly for humanitarian reasons in one country, shouldn't he also intervene in another?
So what do you make of the new appointment of the Prime Minister today? Do you think that's a good step?
The appointment of the new Prime Minister Ibadi is a very important step, and it is a positive one. It did not come about by chance. This is the result of much politicking within the majority Shiite community in Iraq. It also indicates a conclusion that the Iranian government came to, that they cannot move forward with Maliki, and also reflects very intense pressure from the U.S. I think the outgoing Prime Minister is clinging to power for a few more days. He might want to also extract some concessions or guarantees that he will not be prosecuted afterwards, but I think he will be on his way out.
All right, Paul Salem, we appreciate you visiting us from the Policy and Research Institute. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. Trucks carrying aid arrived in Gaza today as a 72-hour ceasefire between Israel and Hamas began. The lull in the violence allowed Palestinians to leave their homes and shelters as negotiators agreed to resume peace talks in Egypt. The truce took effect just past midnight after a violent weekend. So far, the ceasefire seems to be holding. Israel's army and Hamas militants have been fighting for 1 month now, More than 1,900 Palestinians, mainly civilians, have died, according to Palestinian and UN officials. 67 Israelis have been killed, all but 3 of them soldiers. An aging passenger plane has crashed in Tehran, killing at least 39 people. The Iranian Fars news agency reported the plane went down shortly after leaving the runway at Tehran's international airport. It was carrying 40 passengers and a crew of 8. The crash also injured people on the ground, including employees at a glass factory, some suffering burns, severe burns. A witness told reporters the tail of the plane fell from the sky first, and the front of the plane crashed farther away. Some lawmakers in Iran have questioned the use of this twin-engine turboprop built with Ukrainian technology off an old Soviet-era design. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani has ordered them grounded until investigators determine the cause of Sunday's crash. Ukraine has now agreed to allow Russian aid convoys into its territory. Ukraine and the West have been resisting Russia's offers to send humanitarian aid to people in the separatist-held areas of eastern Ukraine. The U.S. and allies have warned Russia not to send forces or military groups without UN authorization. They say doing so would be seen as an invasion force. The use of an experimental drug to treat a Spanish priest and 2 Americans infected with the Ebola virus is raising ethical questions. Father Miguel Paredes was last reported in stable conditions since receiving the drug. Bioethicists are wondering, why don't the African victims of Ebola have access to this potentially life-saving treatment? The Ebola serum known as ZMapp is in scarce supply. Its makers in San Diego say it's working to increase production. ZMapp's potential effectiveness may be a welcoming development in nations where hundreds have died from a virus with no known cure. Meanwhile, today the UN is convening medical experts to debate the ethics of using experimental vaccines. There's been looting, violence, and protests in a St. Louis suburb. This after a police officer shot an unarmed African-American teen over the weekend. Jason Calvi is back with us tonight covering that story. Jason.
Well, Brian, the St. Louis County Police Chief said someone pushed a police officer into a squad car on Saturday, but it's unclear what happened, and exactly there are conflicting accounts on what exactly happened. Today, tensions remain high.
About 250 protesters face off with police today in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson. This protest remained peaceful, but there was looting and violence last night, with police arresting 32 people for assault, burglary, and theft. The initial incident was Saturday when a police officer killed an unarmed 18-year-old named Michael Brown. Police say there was a scuffle between the officer and Brown or another unknown person near the officer's cruiser. That's when the officer used his gun. The case reminds some about the Trayvon Martin case in Florida, and the Brown family now has the lawyer in that case to represent them.
They're devastated. You know, their son was doing all the right things, graduated from high school, never been in trouble.
Ferguson's police chief says the case is active.
What we want to do is we want to heal. We want to build trust with the community, and part of that is to have a transparent, open investigation conducted by an outside party.
But inside the Brown family, a mother is left grieving and looking for answers.
He don't bother nobody. My son just turned 18 and graduated from high school. He don't bother nobody.
And one other development today, the FBI says they'll be investigating the case, looking for civil rights violations surrounding the shooting in Bryan. The officer involved in the case has been placed on paid leave right now.
Jason Calvi reporting. Thank you. Ohio's execution moratorium, scheduled to expire this week, has now been extended into next year. A federal judge's ruling highlights this ongoing problem faced by states in obtaining drugs to put inmates to death. For decades, states used the same 3-drug formula for lethal injections, but most major drug makers have stopped selling pharmaceuticals for use in execution, citing ethical concerns. Botched executions in several states have raised questions about the drug combination now being used. Ohio's prisons agency says, quote, it remains committed to carrying out executions in a humane and lawful manner. A sailboat crew stranded in a stormy sea with Hurricane Julio approaching has been rescued tonight. The 42-foot walkabout was being battered with high winds and giant waves. The Coast Guard says the 3 sailors are safe and in good condition tonight after being rescued by the crew of a huge container ship. They were sailing from California to Hawaii, according to the Coast Guard. The sailboat was stranded in 30-foot seas with winds approaching 115 miles per hour. It was taking on water, and the vessel's life raft blew overboard. The giant ship had to wait for calmer seas before attempting the rescue. And in the Gulf of Mexico, the oyster harvest has been cut by a third since the giant BP oil spill in 2010. Catherine Elliott reports.
The Louisiana Gulf Coast, one of the nation's leading oyster producers, has fallen on hard times.
We've never seen it before like this.
Third-generation fisherman Randy Slavich nets empty oyster shells in the usually bountiful Lake Machias. Most concerning is the lack of new oyster larvae.
It's not coming back on the shells that are left down there on the ground. That's since the spill.
Whether the oil spill is a cause is still under review by the Natural Resource Damage Assessment. The industry was already facing challenges before BP's Macondo well blew wild in 2010. Reefs were still recovering from a series of hurricanes and 2 straight years of oyster-killing freshwater flooding.
It's almost been a perfect storm of negative events that have led to this situation.
BP maintains the spill was not a factor, citing reports that no oil was detected on oyster beds.
The big unanswered question is, did the spill have some effect on the larval stages in the water column? And that's really not known yet.
As the wait for answers continues, a solution catching in Louisiana is the planting of new hard surfaces, like crumbled concrete, for young oysters to attach. An area Slavich planted not long after the oil spill is starting to show signs of life and hope for future harvests. Catherine Elliott, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, is it a case of racetrack rage? A driver is struck and killed by NASCAR great Tony Stewart. And baby Gammy's Australian parents deny claims by his surrogate mother that they don't want him. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, August 11th, good evening. I'm Brian Patrick, and Turkey's prime minister is about to become that country's first directly elected president. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been prime minister for more than a decade during a time of unprecedented growth. He's been a divisive figure and in the past year has cracked down on civil unrest and corruption allegations. The 60-year-old Erdogan has vowed to transform the presidency from a largely ceremonial post into a powerful position. His critics fear he is bent on a power grab as he embarks on another 5 years at the country's helm. Turkey's governing party is now debating who should be the next prime minister. Over the years, of course, Turkey has largely maintained strong ties with the U.S. and is a NATO partner. NASCAR triple champion Tony Stewart is cooperating with police after fatally striking another driver during a race on Saturday. Catherine Zeltner has more.
Tragedy on the racetrack. 20-year-old race car driver Kevin Ward Jr. killed after he steps out of his car and onto the track. Hit by one of the sport's greatest drivers, Tony Stewart, a 3-time NASCAR champion.
It's just an unbelievable tragedy. Our hearts go out to obviously Kevin and his family.
The deadly hit coming after the 14th lap of a 25-lap race on this dirt track in upstate New York Saturday night. Watch what happens as Stewart's car closes in on Ward's, cutting him off. Ward's car is forced up against the wall, where he spins out. As the race continues, amateur video shows Ward out of his car, pointing his finger, seemingly in the direction of Stewart's car. One car swerves around Ward. Stewart's car hits him. Ward's death now under investigation.
The investigation, when it's completed, we will sit down with the district attorney and review it. But I want to make it very clear, there are no criminal charges pending at this time.
Stewart is cooperating with investigators. Yesterday, the NASCAR great decided to pull out of another race just hours before it started, saying in part, "It's a very emotional time for all involved, and it is the reason I've decided not to participate in today's race." A year ago on this same dirt track, Stewart was part of a multi-car pileup, later reportedly claiming responsibility for that crash.
It just looked like, to me, someone who got wrecked by Tony Stewart was very upset, wanted to show his displeasure, and in the process of doing that, got caught up in a terrible accident.
Catherine Zeltner, EWTN News Nightly.
And the parents at the center of an international surrogacy case are speaking out for the first time. David and Wendy Farnell told Australia's 60 Minutes they didn't want to leave their baby boy Gammy behind in Thailand. Gammy has Down syndrome. He was born with a twin sister through a surrogate mother in Thailand. The parents claim the Thai surrogate wanted both of the babies, so they left with the girl in order to protect her.
The surrogate mother wanted to take our girl. And we were getting scared that we were going to lose her. So we had to try to get out as fast as we could.
The Thai surrogate disagrees. She says she was afraid baby Gammy would be put into an institution. The Farnells are working to bring Gammy home right now, they say, but David Farnell is a convicted sex offender. He spent time in prison, which could really complicate matters. Farnell says he regrets his actions and they won't be repeated.
I know that I do not have any urges at all of this nature. For 30 years, I've known this.
Farnell says he knows how people view sex offenders, but he claims that that will only push him to strive to be a better father. Pope Francis takes off for South Korea later this week. It will be the Holy Father's first trip to Asia. Preparations are underway in Seoul. Streets there are lined with banners welcoming Pope Francis. Workers have been setting up posters for a photo exhibit called Hello, Pope Francis. South Korea is even releasing stamps to commemorate the Pope's visit. Pope Francis will beatify more than 100 Korean martyrs and celebrate Asian Youth Day with young people from across the Asian continent. We will bring you exclusive reports from Korea surrounding the Pope's visit. EWTN News Nightly producer Susie Pinto will be on the ground in Seoul later this week. Our Alan Holdren travels with Pope Francis on the papal plane from Rome to Seoul. He'll take us along for every step of this apostolic journey. Don't miss it this week on EWTN News Nightly. Up next, a device in this new shoe could help seniors avoid falling, making them more mobile. And it's bigger, brighter. Look up in the sky. It's supermoon. An update on the crisis in Iraq as President Obama speaks just a short time ago congratulating the Iraqi Prime Minister-designate and urging him to take action.
There's no American military solution to the larger crisis in Iraq. The only lasting solution is for Iraqis to come together and form an inclusive government, one that represents the legitimate interests of all Iraqis, and one that can unify the country's fight against ISIL.
The president made those remarks late this afternoon from Martha's Vineyard. He's vacationing there with his family. He was already expected to address that situation in Iraq during a Democratic fundraiser on the island tonight. Well, it's called the B shoe, B for balancing. Its developers say it will prevent nasty falls and maybe serious injuries. A special motion device embedded in the shoe detects when a person is losing their balance. The Israeli developers say the B shoe makes a correction before the fall.
The problem of falling is spread worldwide. This is a problem that grows as life expectancy grows. The statistics show that every person after the age of 65 falls once every 3 years, from the age of 72 once every 2 years, and from the age of 80 once a year. A large part of the falls end in death within a year, and the majority of those who have fallen will remain disabled.
When an imbalance is detected, the motion device rolls the shoe slightly and gently back, making a backward step, and balance is regained. It's encouraging to active seniors who are often slowed down by a fear of falling.
I walk pretty fast. I'm always in a hurry to get someplace. Yes, I'm always rushing. But, it's like in the back of my mind.
The vision behind B shoe is twofold. Keep people steady on their feet and give them their confidence back.
Brings you back being more younger, because you are behaving like before, like you have been 10 years ago, when you don't fear from anything.
Experts say when people are afraid of falling, they have the tendency to crouch forward. So the B shoe may help to allow more seniors to walk tall. Finally, did you the supermoon last night? A supermoon is when the moon is at its closest point to Earth, 12% bigger, 30% brighter than usual. It can even be seen during the daytime. They were taking pictures all over the world. In case you missed it, there's another supermoon on September 9th. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, good night and God bless you.